Good afternoon. My name is Bo Kong, and I'm the ConocoPhillips Petroleum Associate Professor of Chinese and Asian Studies. And welcome to the Institute's speaker series on STEEP issues, which promote dialogue on security, technology, economic, environmental, public health, and political issues in U.S.-China relations. Today marks the beginning of the ninth month of the Russo-Ukraine war. In addition to causing tremendous atrocities and casualties on the battlefield, the war has redrawn the geopolitical landscape in Europe, created a profound economic and environmental consequences, especially regarding energy security, food security, and climate action, reshaped the international order with respect to the use of force and great power politics, and added great uncertainties to the already intense US-China rivalry. To understand the implications of the war for US-China relations from a Chinese perspective, I'm extremely pleased to moderate this discussion by my dear friend and respected colleague, whom I've known since we did our graduate work together at the Hopkins Nanjing Center back in 2000. Dr. Zhao Hai is uniquely well-positioned to help us understand how China thinks about and responds to the war, thanks to his extensive expertise and access to the Chinese political system. He's the Director of International Politics at the National Institute for Global Strategy, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, one of the most preeminent government-affiliated think tanks in China. He's concurrently a research fellow at the Institute of World Economics and Politics within the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Zhao will discuss U.S.-China relations against the backdrop of Russo-Ukraine war. His research focuses on U.S.-China relations, Chinese foreign policy, and global governance. Besides academic publications, he's also a frequent international affairs opinion contributor to the China Daily and a guest commentator at the China Radio International and China Global Television Network. Previously, Dr. Zhao worked as a research fellow at the National Strategy Institute of Tsinghua University and held various think tank positions in Chicago and Washington, D.C. Dr. Zhao is a historian by training. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Chicago and earned his master's degree in world history and a dual bachelor's degree in history and law from Peking University. Before turning the podium to today's speaker, please allow me to thank my colleagues, Stephanie Seeger and Mauro McAndrew, for providing the logistical assistance that has made this event possible. Without further ado, Dr. Zhao, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Kong. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And it's a great pleasure to be able to talking to you, even though not face-to-face, but fortunately, at this point, we can use Zoom, even though I guess we all hate Zoom. At this point, 3 years into the COVID public health crisis. But I think today we have only limited time to talk about U.S.-China relations against the backdrop of Russo-Ukraine war. Just one issue, U.S.-China relations, is complicated and difficult enough to talk about within a limited time frame. Adding this very complex current war in Ukraine is making it more difficult. So when Professor Kong asked me to talk about this, I'm thinking about exactly how can I explain the Chinese position and also the current China-US relations, the status of it, and how what is the future prospect of this most important relationship. So as Professor Kong introduced, that I'm a trained historian. So I would not look at this and present this from a theoretical perspective, but rather from a historical perspective by talking about the progress of U.S.-China relations in the last couple of years, and particularly the past year, and also to explain to you the Chinese thinking and Chinese view of the US policies towards China and how China responded to the view of the US and also, for that matter, for the whole West. So let me start, and I have a very brief PPT to share with you. I'll put it up. Hope you can see this. Okay, so let's start. First of all, before we go further, I wanted to go back and review what happened in the last couple of years, what happened to US-China relations, and why, when the war happened, China is in a very awkward position vis-a-vis Russia, and also in a very tense relations with the United States. So I returned to China from the United States in a very opportune time by the end of 2015. When I returned, I entered into a think tank in Tsinghua University and directly dived into the study and the research and policy recommendations on US-China relations. What happened in 2016, if you remember, is the year of the election, and the Trump administration, of course, came in by the end of the year, replacing the Obama administration. At the time, when the Obama administration was on the way out of the door, we were talking to their officials, and they were asking us exactly, what both countries can do to continue the conversation, and also, what are the last wishes from the Chinese side, because they expect that China-U.S. relations will deteriorate. Not just because of what Trump said during his campaign, but also what happened in the last couple of years, lack of progress and the continuous accumulation of differences between the two countries. So back then, we were concerned about the coming in Trump administration. However, we were not expecting such a shock from Trump himself, and also such an impact on China-U.S. relations. So exactly what happened is that right after Trump was elected, he made a phone call with the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, and started the first crisis between the two countries. And in the future, of course, in the next next month, China is trying, of course, to try to save this relationship and trying to propose some of the positive agenda for the two countries to work on. However, it's not successful, obviously, because in the beginning, we tried to sort of please Trump himself and try to make sure that we made some affordable concessions in exchange for stabilizing the relationship, and not particularly for Trump to find a reason to turn his campaign promise into reality. For instance, he campaigned on adding 45% tariff on Chinese goods coming into the United States. But at the end of the day, after Mar-a-Lago meeting in April of 2017, after the first 100-day action plan, and particularly after Trump's visit, we call State Visit Plus in October 2017, all those efforts failed. Because at the same time, in the Trump administration, people are working on some of the things that China deems as very threatening. There are two things that we thought were particularly troublesome. First of all, we discovered, of course, starting from August of 2017, the United States has already started the 301 investigation and is trying to impose tariff after that investigation. And second of all, by the end of 2017, the US has come up with a new national security strategy that turns or name China as a revisionist country and also a near-peer competitor to the United States, which fundamentally changing the relationship between the US and China and elevating China basically into the position to threat the United States and make United States to try to focus on China and compete with China. So in the Chinese political circle, people are very uncomfortable with the definition of China-US relationship as competition. Even though there are a number of US officials coming into China trying to explain what competition in English context means. However, in Chinese culture, it's very hard for China to accept that competition as a definition for the bilateral relationship. And of course, after that, China and the US falling into a trade war throughout 2018, and both sides adding tariff against each other. By the end of the year, there's another crisis happen when Canada detained Huawei's CFO. And after that, I think the relationship is getting worse and worse. But in order to change that, and in order to save this relationship, President Xi at least made the utmost effort trying to talk with talk with Trump and trying to find a common ground to work with Trump. That happened in the G20 in Argentina by the end of 2018. So by then, both sides decided, on the one hand, they will start negotiating a deal in the 90 days in 2019. That's number one. And number two, they will maintain contact with each other. And right after that, of course, the Canadians detained Meng Wanzhou at the time when the Argentina meeting is happening. So after that, I think the US side is trying to explain that this is not the exact idea of Trump, and Trump trying to reverse that by making some of the soft sort of positions welcoming the negotiation between the two sides. So by early 2019, it seems like both sides are getting closer to a deal. And of course, the deal came out, and ultimately China is saying no to that deal that Trump thought it's already on the table. That happened in April of 2019, which makes things much more worse and much more complicated. By then, the US side is trying to figure out exactly why China sort of didn't pass the version that it is negotiated by two sides, by two representatives. On the Chinese side, Vice Premier Liu He, and on the US side, Leithizer, the USTR. What happened is that, of course, when they negotiated a deal and turned back to China to try to collect comments on this deal, many ministries and many top leadership circle, people are against this deal and thinking this deal violate China's national sovereignty, and also very unequal between the two sides, which means that that deal will hurt China and will not benefit China, and China is not getting anything out of that deal. So back then, President Xi also under pressure, thinking that this is not going through, so he didn't approve that. But then of course, the market collapsed, and both sides are under great pressure to meet again at the next G20 in Japan's Osaka. But that Osaka meeting didn't yield the prospect of a good deal coming out of that meeting, and the market continued to go down, and the negotiation is under strain, and people are still trying to push from all sides, trying to repair this relationship. And of course, by then, Trump already lost his midterm and trying to save his presidential campaign by 2020. So both sides, again, under huge pressure from the business class, from the elites, and from both countries. So ultimately, they reach a deal basically by the end of 2019. So they signed a deal in the first month of 2020. So it looks like this tense trade relationship is finally getting a U-turn and find its way back to normal. And because of this deal, basically people believe that China will purchase a huge amount of American goods in exchange for America to reduce or delay certain tariff and maintain some sort of normal relationship between the two sides on trade. But that deal, of course, collapsed because of the advent of COVID crisis. And the COVID crisis fundamentally changed the nature of the bilateral relationship because of this COVID happened in the United States, and the US didn't have, or the Trump administration didn't even try to control the widespread COVID-19 crisis and trying to, they don't have a very good way to deal with this. So they try to shift blame towards China and use all the opportunities to basically put a lot of political blames on China, and also put out a lot of other issues, including Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, all the other issues, trying to criticize China, blame China, what we call extreme pressure or bullyism from the US side. And also Chinese believe that at this point it's really buck passing, not a real political argument, but all the way trying to shift the blame or shift the responsibility from the Trump administration to China. So things are getting worse and worse at the beginning of 2020 with the COVID situation getting worse in the United States. And we saw a series of speaks coming out of the Trump administration criticizing China and pushing the bilateral relationship getting closer and closer to a Cold War. So another meeting happened between Yang Jiechi and Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo, in Hawaii in June of 2020. Both sides trying to put this strain under control and find possible ways to reduce tension in the bilateral relationship. But Pompeo was very anti-China, and his rhetoric and also his position, his very hardline position, making compromise basically impossible. And after that meeting, China and the US never come back again, during the Trump administration at least, to find another way to reduce tensions. And right after that, Pompeo came to the Nixon Library and delivered a very famous, and from Chinese perspective, infamous speech on China-US relations, and basically saying that the engagement strategy or engagement policy that the US executed for the past 40 years expired and is no longer working for China-US relations. Therefore, the US need a new strategy towards China. And it's no longer competition, it's even more than that. It's basically trying to subvert and making Communist Party of China as the enemy of the United States. So by then, for instance, the US no longer call President Xi Jinping, but always claim his General Secretary Xi Jinping of Communist China. So all the rhetoric is going back to the 1950s, like McCarthyism, and all the rhetoric pointing to the US trying to start a new Cold War and putting Communist China or the Communist Party of China as the enemy of the United States. So things looking like it's getting out of control. And by the end of 2020, from China, we worried about that the Trump looks like he's going to lose the 2020 presidential election. And because of what he's done and what his administration's top officials said about China, China really worried about that the US would start a war before the election and try to create some sort of October surprise, even creating some sort of a tense relationship with China in order to push up his political support domestically. So that worry grew tremendously by October. And as you can see later on, people revealed that General Miley, the General Staff of the United States, actually made calls with China, the defense minister, twice in order to explain to Chinese side that the US military would not start a war with China. And if there's some sort of a military action, the US will inform China in order to avoid any potential misunderstanding. So that's how situation developed by the end of 2020, and that's how China is expecting, at least, that when there's another new administration coming in, the Biden administration, things will definitively better than the previous Trump administration, because at least we expect the Biden administration would be professional and would treat China-U.S. relations with reason and with the better, deeper understanding of historical relationship between the two sides, and find common ground to move forward this relationship, not moving this relation backward. So I think that's how China is expecting this relationship to develop. However, China's expectation falls apart, and the disappointment of the Biden administration and its handling of China-U.S. relationship is very widespread by the summer of 2021. So when Biden administration came in, and both sides, of course, have some expectations of each other. And between the think tanks of U.S. and China, there are multiple communication channels, and people are talking about how to reverse some of the Trump administration damages on the bilateral relationship, and how to restore communication lines, and how to find ways to alleviate some of the very tense issues, very dangerous issues and confrontational issues, and particularly issues like Xinjiang, like Hong Kong and Taiwan. But all those are not talked about, and it looks like, and now we realize that the Biden administration came in with the idea already installed in their minds, trying to build a coalition against China instead of trying to negotiate a peaceful, like, coexistence deal with China. So what happened is that there was only one attempt by the U.S. side trying to talk with China, and the location was chosen, which is in Alaska, on the way back from Japan and Korea trip for the U.S. top officials on the way back from East Asia back to the United States. They don't even want to go into China or somewhere near China to talk with the Chinese delegate, and they chose a place within the United States to talk with us. And going into that meeting, of course, China is trying to find common ground with the U.S. and discovered that the U.S. is just pointing fingers at Chinese political system. And of course, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi in that meeting openly repelled any attack from the U.S. side, and also indicated that China will not cave in to the so-called position of strength that is the U.S. side is talking about. So this collapse of Alaska meeting is a very bad omen for the future development of bilateral relationship between the Biden administration and China. And of course, later developments reinforce China's impression that ultimately Biden administration is continuing the Trump administration's anti-China policy instead of reverse course or trying to find some solution between the two sides. One of the most important indicator is the U.S. Complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. Even though we expect the U.S. to negotiate a deal with Taliban and withdraw from Afghanistan, but not in such a manner, not withdraw in a very quick and irresponsible way from China's perspective, and not communicating with China in advance. And from China's perspective, that sudden withdrawal is definitely aimed at saving U.S. strategic assets, relocating that to East Asia and trying to encircle China, and keeping pressure on China, while at the same time reducing U.S. burden in other areas, Middle East, Central Asia, or Africa, anywhere else. So that looks like the U.S. is doubling down on its policy towards China instead of reducing any tensions. So it looks like more and more like a new Cold War from Chinese perspective, when after the withdrawal of Afghanistan, the U.S. created another military security alliance in Asia. It's called AUKUS, America, UK, and Australia, UK, and US. So AUKUS. So the AUKUS is in addition to Quad that the US already established and reinforced in the region. And now that what China called a small circle is increasing in its ability to threat China, and increasing from China's perspective, it's increasing and racial undertone against China, because all the countries that the US now is trying to tighten up as security alliance, like Five Eyes, like Quad, like AUKUS, if you look into it, its core is more like an Anglo-Saxon white dominance, and trying to maintain that dominance in the region, and not really increasing a more inclusive alliance in the region. So again, China is feeling more and more threat, and that is the reason why China is getting closer and closer to Russia. While at the same time, the US is building its alliance in the West Pacific, China has no other reliable political partner against the US other than Russia. So that's why President Xi and President Putin is getting closer with each other, and along the way, getting closer not just economically, but politically, economically, but more and more militarily. And one of the most significant event that shows the unity of the two leaders, of course, the Winter Olympics. For China, Winter Olympics is about faith. It's about the national pride. But the US, of course, prior to the Winter Olympics, organized a democracy summit, which is definitely and very clearly aimed at China. And after that, also called on other countries to basically boycott China's Winter Olympics, which enraged Chinese leadership. So Putin is one of the most important world leaders coming into the Winter Olympics. And for that, China needs to show hospitality. And that's why the both sides decided to issue a joint statement, and in which the most important word picked out by Western media is that China and Russia said their strategic partnership has no limits. And no limits in the Western context, European countries in particular believe that's a strategic or kind of military, quasi-military alliance just without a treaty. So that makes, again, the Ukraine war, the outbreak of the Ukraine war just 3 weeks later, even more suspicious, because because looking back, the February 4th joint statement looks like China is endorsing and supporting and probably secretly coordinating with Russia and supporting that war in Ukraine that is about to happen. But the reality, the truth is, and China reiterated this many times, that during the meeting, during the Winter Olympics, the meeting between President Xi and President Putin never even mentioned that the Ukraine issue with President Xi. He explained some of the Soviet Union's history and how the Ukraine issues comes about, but never said a word about his military preparation and the invasion of Ukraine. So that's the whole background of what's happening before the Ukraine war. And very briefly, I want to show you this S&P China index and how the capital market is responding to the up and downs of US-China relationship. And you can see that the Trump shock makes the market goes down. When the trade deal is negotiated, the market is coming back. And when COVID happened, of course, China's lockdown initially was very successful, which contributed to the upward swing of the capital investment in China. But of course, later on, China is overconfident and started to talk about common prosperity, dual circulation, and the market goes back down again. And when Ukraine crisis happened, it touched a very low point. And after that, Ukraine shock, of course, that what happened is that the Shanghai lockdown and continuous zero COVID policy that's weighing down on China's economy and dragging it until today. And that's that's the background of Ukraine crisis. So now let's talk about the Ukraine crisis and how China's responding to that. So on the day of the outbreak of this war, China's also, I mean, most of the people that I talk to are in disbelief because many people truly believe that it is impossible for Russia to start a war at this time on Ukraine, and there's no winning strategy on the battleground and also politically. But at the same time, when we start to witnessing the raid on Kiev and how that failed in the initial stage of the war, we deeply believe that this war is from the very beginning a wrong war to start with, and probably, I mean, we pretty much believe that probably Putin was misinformed and made a very bad strategic decision. However, that said, I mean, the war has already started, and China needs to show its position and needs to tell the world where China is standing. And that is a very difficult diplomatic problem because, number one, domestically, China itself is deeply divided. As you can see that, China's divided into many camps, mostly two camps, and the two camps are attacking each other. One camp, of course, supporting the Ukrainians and saying that sovereignty is most important. The other camp is supporting the Russians and saying that, at this time, jointly fighting against U.S. hegemony is the most important issue and most urgent issue. And both sides are calling names now. One side is calling the other goose fans, and goose in Chinese is 鹅, and Russia also in Chinese is 俄国. So goose fans means the Russian fans. And the Russian fans is calling Ukraine supporters Krau Nazis because Krau is 乌鸦 in Chinese, and Ukraine in Chinese is 乌克兰. So both sounds Wu, and Krau is referring to the Ukraine. And they, of course, they are siding with the Russians, calling Ukrainians fighters Nazis. So Krau Nazis referring to Ukrainian fans, and both fans are fighting each other on Weibo, Chinese Twitter, and also on all kinds of platforms. And this makes the Chinese decision maker in a very awkward position because China has no united position domestically. And also, it's a diplomatic problem because China has already tightened its relationship, and particularly President Xi and Putin has a personal friendly relationship. And right now, it's very difficult for China to suddenly turn against Russia and criticize Russia on its military action. So it's a conundrum that we're in. And at the same time, as we are witnessing the Russian military operation, we're also in a very self-reckoning sort of stage because, of course, Chinese military inherited a lot of Russian legacy in terms of weapon, in terms of military doctrine. And we look at, and most Chinese people believe that the Russian army is world number 2, and believe that a lot of they still, even though they're not like the former Soviet Union, but they still have a lot of military advancement in the past couple of years because of its domestic reform and because of Putin's emphasis on the modernization of the Russian army. However, what happened on the battleground really shocked the Chinese, and particularly the goose fans, because they realized that the Russian military is not what they say. And if the Russians cannot take on the Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainians with support of NATO and with the United States, then of course China starts to think about, once we are needed to use force against Taiwan, then we will fall into some kind of trap, and our military may not be tested and pass the test on the battleground. So there's a lot of reckoning, a lot of soul searching after witnessing what happened on the battleground. And the next thing, of course, is wave after wave of sanctions. And that sanctions not just coming out of the United States, but coming out of the whole West. There are 40 plus countries coming together to sanction Russia. And the EU is sanctioning Russia again and again. So far is about up to 8 batches. So all those sanctions coming together is also warning China to prepare itself, because looking at those sanctions, China's thinking all bets are off, because what we used to believe that the assets are safe or untouchable are now all under threat, or even some frozen, some confiscated, some transactions are stopped or banned or sanctioned, and a lot of the technologies stop. It's floating into Russia, and also Russia's most important commodity is gradually phasing out of the European market. So we're looking at all those sanctions and starts to think about how, if that happened to China, then what we should do, how we should deal with it. And we examine currently what asset class we're holding in Western countries. And if same sanction applied to China, what could happen to us? And of course, at this juncture, we heard the US is actually talking with the Europeans and coordinating with them, and talk about what would happen if China at this time started to invade Taiwan, what kind of sanctions that they would impose on China. So from military perspective, from financial, economic perspective, from diplomatic, political perspective, we're all falling into a sort of panic mode and start to think about things that we never used to thought about before. And that is what we called dangerous storms, or one of the storms, actually a perfect storm that is coming towards China. Other than that, of course, other than the direct impact, there are spillover effects of Ukraine crisis as well, and that's impacting China at the same time, because the Ukraine crisis is impacting European economy, and the European market is one of the most important markets for China. And also that crisis pushing up inflation, forcing the US to raise interest rate, making capital more expensive. At this time, because China's economy is going through difficulties, China actually wanted to lower interest rate, which the US increase of its interest rate actually prevented China to go further, because otherwise China's currency will devalue. So all those are complicating China's choices and making China's position very difficult. Of course, the other thing that China has to think about is that because of China's closeness to Russia and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, things are getting much more complicated, and China's relation with the US, of course, is also complicated, because at this point, a lot of the US strategists or European politicians start to talk about China's relations with Russia, and also start to threaten China if China support Russia's war effort in Ukraine, and also start to think about its relationship with China, including supply chain, including particularly Taiwan. So there are a range of issues that needs to be reconsidered and renegotiated at this point. But at this particular point, the communication channels between China and the US is not really clear and open, because it's still after the first stage of the Biden administration. Those communications lines are still not restored or reopened. So at this point, I think the misunderstanding and mutual suspicion are increasing to a new high. So a couple of things. Number one is tariff. In the beginning of the Biden administration, we thought that because during the campaign, Biden thought the tariff, both sides are wrong. He wanted to reduce the tariff or get rid of it. So we're expecting that. However, what we heard is a very different story. When the US side is talking to us, they're asking what can Beijing offer in exchange for lower the tariff. And we say that your inflation is going up. If you reduce the tariff, you can help yourself. It's not helping us. We can reduce our tariff against the US at the same time. So what more are you asking? And the US side respond, of course, is that the inflation is just transitory. And that gain from reducing the tariff is not enough to compensate the strategic or geopolitical pressure that tariff can exert on China. So that's why so far the US still maintained the tariff and refused to talk about the re-examination or a reduction of the tariff, even expanding the exclusion of tariff. And we also ask the US side whether or not they wanted to start phase 2 negotiation after phase 1 deal with Trump administration. And the Biden administration, and particularly Catherine Tai herself, saying that there's no more to talk about, and they only wanted to talk about with their allies and partners, and through the newly created framework called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPAF. And after they organized their group of new trade structure, and then after that, they wanted to come back to talk with China from the so-called position of strength. So that effort failed so far. And then when they moved to Taiwan, it's even worse, because now after the Ukrainian successful resistance to Russian, the US wanted to move that experience towards Taiwan. And of course, Taiwanese started to talk about the so-called porcupine strategy, which makes basically talking about how Taiwanese themselves can arm themselves against the possible invasion of the mainland, and equipped Taiwanese people, its civilians, with weaponry to start urban warfare training, and also maybe other forms of popular resistance. And at this point, other than the previous 42 billion undelivered weapons they wanted to accelerate, they started a new batch, which is amount to 1.1 billion sales to the Taiwanese, and are trying to increase military stock on the Taiwan island. And those weapons are not normal sales. Now they're talking about anti-ship, anti-surface-to-air or air-to-air combat missiles in a very large quantity delivered to Taiwan. So that, of course, increased the threat level to Chinese military deployed on the other side of Taiwan Strait. And right after that, of course, in the past couple of months, the Americans passed the Chips and Science Act, in which specifically limited the chip factory to expand its production in China, and basically stopped China's possibility of developing further advanced process technology to make new generation of chips in future competition with the United States. And later on, right after the Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, American Congress started to talk about the Taiwan Policy Act of 2022. And if you go through that, the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee version that passed in September 15th, it's even more threatening, because in that new act, the US basically abandoned the One China policy, or from Chinese perspective, hollowed up One China policy and shaken to the core the fundamental, or the basic foundation of US-China relations. So again, this is making things from China's perspective looking worse and worse, and the tension looks like unavoidable. So the true cost, again, for the Pelosi's, what China call her mousy visit, we call 窜访. It's not just normal visit, but a very secretive, sneaky kind of visit to Taiwan, basically dismantled or stopped any possibility of establishing guardrails between China and the US, because there's no longer trust between the two sides. And her visit is a call to arms, both for China, and because of China's response or countermeasures, there's a call to arms in the United States. So the possibility of war across Taiwan Strait is continuously escalating at this point. And when there are irresponsible people, I think on both sides, and particularly in the US, talking about somehow China has already fixated on a date which is 2027, to resolve the problem and forcefully unify Taiwan by 2027, add the fire, add the wood to the fire, basically making things even worse and accelerated the preparation for war. So I think at this point, we have some bad news already I've talked about, and possibly some good news. The bad news, of course, is that both sides are talking about a critical decade. The US side, in its new national security strategy, named this decade the most critical decade. They believe if they can deter China's rising, then China will peak, and in the future, China, because of a lot of the demographic or economic issues, China can no longer catch up with the US, and therefore the challenge will diminish. So at this decade, it's critical for the US trying every possible way to deter China. From Chinese perspective, if you read the 20th Party Congress, it's also a critical 5 to 10 years for President Xi, because he wanted to make China strong. He wanted to rejuvenate the nation, of course. And the US now is the number one obstacle for China to realize is rejuvenation. And of course, China is named top priority in US NSS report as the top revisionist autocracy. So both sides are locking horns, and now looks like heading towards a unavoidable sort of conflict or confrontation with each other. However, I think if you look into the NSS report and China's Party Congress report, there's still room for two sides to cooperate on some global governance issues, and also trying to avoid real hot war between the two sides. Even though there's potential conflict, but both sides wanted to manage this competition and make it still a competition on technology, on national governance and capacity, rather than direct military conflict. And Chinese side in particular emphasized peaceful coexistence. Previously, we still wanted to emphasize that the relationship is cooperative and cooperation is the only option for two sides. But now China is no longer talking about cooperation, because it looks like the US side is no longer interested. So we're stepping back and trying to advocate peaceful coexistence and trying to make that a common ground between US and China, because at the same time, Biden is talking about guardrails. So hopefully in the future, we can establish some of the bottom lines and mutual understanding between US and China, so that we can manage this bilateral relationship responsibly and peacefully coexist while competing with each other. So looking forward, I think we need to really pay a lot of attention to what's going to happen in G20 this year. The US side looks like they wanted top leaders meeting to happen. And Chinese side is also preparing for that summit in Indonesia in the coming month. I think it's November 15th to 16th. However, it's still unclear, because Chinese side never confirmed the meeting, because it's still 3-4 weeks away. One of the reasons is that in order for the summit to happen, and particularly make that summit successful, both sides need to find some common ground, at least to restore some of the communication lines and find some of the cooperating areas to bridge the gap, and at least make the management of this bilateral relationship possible and viable. So at this point, I think they still don't have a plan, or still trying to negotiate a possible statement or deal before that meeting. So we need to observe that and follow that closely and see if that's going to happen. Because if this year the G20 fails, then I think in the future, the global governance or the global system will definitely be divided, fragmented, or even develop into a parallel system, and making the governance of this world even more difficult. And the conflict then after that will be more easier to break out in other part of the world. And I think it's definitely not good news for the people of these two great countries. And I think in some way, Russians or Iranians or a lot of other countries are waiting for this as good news, because they are looking forward for China and the US to totally and completely break up, decouple, and for China to turn around and give full support to Russia, Iran, and other countries. But of course, it is almost impossible for China to give up the markets and the connections with the global, with the developed world, the Western countries, because of the ties. So what can we do in the future? I think it's very important for us to understand the nature of this relationship. There's a very interesting metaphor we call oasis metaphor for both sides. When the both sides when John Kelly visited China and trying to reconnect with Chinese team and work with China on the climate change issues, the US side is saying that even though there's desert outside the climate change issue as an oasis, but still we need to maintain and protect this oasis, and if necessary, de-link this issue with other issues in order to continue our cooperation. But the Chinese side is saying the reverse and saying that if outside this oasis it's all desert, then how can we cooperate just on this single issue? Because ultimately this oasis will be destroyed by the growing of the outside desert. So I think it depends really on exactly where you stand and which perspective you're looking at the issue. And then you can understand the oasis metaphor from different standings and different perspectives. But for me, I think the very existence of oasis is very important, which means that both sides needs to find a common ground and needs to grow the oasis from inside out and gradually turn the desert into greenland. And that happened in China in the past decade, and I think it could happen for the bilateral relationship. So a couple of things I would recommend. Number one is that we need to stand up against the military-industrial complex, because at this point, I think that there's a very strong trend. There's a very strong interest group that is trying to make each other enemy of the other so that they can benefit from this growing need for armament and for weaponry, and also for financial support to certain technologies, dual-use technologies. And that's not just the United States, that's also happening in China and growingly so. So I think it's very important for the peace, for the forces for peace to stand up against those arguments for basically using national security as an excuse and expand the definition of national security on almost everything. And number two, I think climate change is still a very urgent, very important issue, and mostly fitted for the two big countries and the greatest carbon dioxide emitters in the world to cooperate with each other. So we need to call for action because COP27 is coming up, and this year COP27 is almost not in focus because people are too distracted by the war in Ukraine. So again, we need to work on climate change and improve this cooperation on this issue. And that's not just on climate change, not just about climate change, but also about renewable energy, about the revolution of new energy, and also how completely change the structure of our economy that is too dependent on fossil oil. And the other thing is that hopefully China can reopen soon, but I won't bet on it. It's probably going to take some time for China to reopen, but still we need to use every possible channel to keep talking, keep the communication open, and deepen our mutual understanding. Because in a lot of cases, there are too many cases in my mind that are actually mutually misunderstanding, not that both sides have bad faith or have bad strategic aims against each other. It's just simply we don't understand fully each other's political systems, political culture, and in a broader sense, our civilizations. So it's very important for us to understand each other, and from that understanding, gradually reduce tension and find common ground on a number of critical issues. Just a couple of days ago, I also worked with other think tanks on coming up with a joint report between US think tank and Chinese think tank, and explain the issues on South China Sea and how there are many common interests on both sides, both the United States and China, that we can work together on South China Sea instead of aiming at each other and making each other enemies. And finally, I think it's important for many elite in both countries to advocate inclusive globalization and make that globalization a globalization 2.0 or neo-globalization. Because without the globalization, without reigniting the effort or the taste for globalization, for economic interdependence, then we will have a world that is divided and very much focused only on security issues and only on individual interest, and falling into this zero-sum game of security dilemma. Only, I think, common interest can save us from this security dilemma and prevent future possible conflict and the collapse of the current international system. So again, I think trade, communications, technology exchanges, and a lot of future-oriented mechanism. Only those things can help us resolve some of the most difficult issues that we're facing today. Okay, that's my presentation today, and I still have probably 15 to 20 minutes to answer your questions. Thank you very much. I see you, Professor Kong. Let's go to the Q&A.
Thank you for being so thorough and shedding light on the Chinese perspectives about why China reacted to the Ukraine war in the way it did, and how China felt increasingly threatened by U.S. policies over the past couple of years. And on that note, I might ask, while others are formulating their questions, whether you could help us understand the limits to China-Russian cooperation when it comes to the bilateral cooperation between China and the United States. Between China and Russia, we often think of the no limit, right? Mm-hmm. The word included in the joint sort of announcement between China and Russia during the Winter Olympics. So what's your take on the limits? Are there limits? If so, what are they? And you talked about the self-awakening in China, about the realities and fallout from the Russo-Ukraine war.
Yeah, that's a very good question. First, just some interesting things, because when the Chinese side, particularly the propaganda wing of the Communist Party, is advocating this no limit thing, and then of course there's fallout of that no limit joint statement. After that, the party central trying to step back on that promise. So that's why Qin Gang, the new ambassador to the United States, when he arrived in the U.S., the first thing he said that, oh yes, China and Russia relationship have no limits, no ceiling, but at the same time, we have bottoms. So that means that on some bottom line issues, on some principles, China disagrees with Russia. And if you look at China-Russia relationship back in 2008 and 2014, there were two occasions when Russia started conflict with Georgia and then reclaimed Crimea. In both cases, China refused to stand with Russia and recognize Russia's position, because all those Russia's occupying areas, and then they have some sort of voting referendum, and then Russia annexed Crimea and created some kind of independent political spaces in Georgia. In all those cases, China is saying that we cannot recognize those areas. We do not share Russia's position on those issues. Today, when Russia hold the referendum in those four oblasts in Ukraine, China said again that China will not recognize those areas being part of Russia. So it's very clear that on those issues, China is still trying to uphold the UN Charter and still trying to uphold the principles of sovereignty and international law. And because China has its own need for sovereignty and international law, therefore on that issue, definitely China cannot side with Russia. That's number one. And number two, that even though China and Russia's economic relationship is rising, I mean, the trade volume increased about 30% in the first half of this year. Overall, China's trade with Russia is very limited, other than energy and military equipment and some of the China's export to Russia, and particularly consumer goods. China and Russia's trade stabilized at about $100 billion every year in the past couple of years. And even though both sides tried very hard to increase the trade, it failed because as you know, the business environment in Russia is very bad for China. Chinese investment never take root in Russia, and also Russia trying to actually prior to the war increase import from European countries, particularly Germany, not from China, because Russian consumers fundamentally don't trust or don't like Chinese so-called cheap goods. Of course, after the sanction, the Russian consumers have no other places to go. Now they're turning towards China, and now China's renminbi is the probably number one traded foreign currency in Moscow. So again, I think this is a convenience relationship, not a strategic relationship, but the foundation is not that solid. And if you compare other issues, economic and other issues, China still share much deeper, much common relationship or common interest with European countries like France or Germany, rather than Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for offering that clarification. I think oftentimes the conventional wisdom plays up with the strength of cooperation between China and Russia, while overlooking some of the fundamental differences between the two countries on a variety of issues that you've talked about. We have a question from the audience that asks you to address the concern you voiced about the neo-McCarthyist sort of sentiment against China in the United States. So the question is, how can the U.S. overcome this sentiment that prevents a rational discussion of China, a rational discussion about U.S. foreign policy toward China and China's real positions? And one can add, you probably see a similar trend in China as well, vis-a-vis the United States. That is the window for the room for discussion with respect to Chinese foreign policy toward the United States is also narrowing. So how do you solve that problem in both capitals, right? I mean, that one could argue it's a typical sort of manifestation of what you might anticipate when you have a security of dilemma.
Exactly. I think it's very, very difficult. If you look at the Cold War era, it's not something that the Soviet did that changed McCarthyism in the United States. It's the uprising of the people against that kind of persecution that ultimately changed its domestic environment. So it really depends on America's self-awakening to some of the racist, some of the anti-communist fever in the United States to change that situation. And also, I think in the past couple of years, many of the Chinese and Asian communities are really standing up against this kind of racist view or racist actions against Chinese people or Asian people in the United States, and successfully in part that they changed or they pressured the DOJ to drop the China initiative. I think that's a very great success. However, that didn't fundamentally change the current situation because again, the tension still there and rising. And recently, one of the most important things is that because of the COVID, both sides, people-to-people exchanges are cut off. And many of the legislations in Congress is trying to cut further ties, particularly student exchange between the two countries. So without mutual understanding, it increased ignorance and increased mutual sort of antagonistic view against each other. So again, I think we need to have more understanding, more communication, particularly young people understand each other's environments, interest and worldview, so that both sides can have a better understanding to stand up against those what can we say against those views that are not real or misinformed or disinformed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I thank you again for that answer. I think it's exactly along the lines of the spirit to promote a more exchange and understanding. We invite you to participate in this discussion, and we thank you for staying up late in Beijing. We have another question from the audience that is why you think China is not willing to take advantage of the personal and country relationship to stop Putin from bombing the civilian areas of Ukraine. Is that not in the UN Charter that China so readily supports?
Well, first of all, I just like, let me give you an example. Just like in North Korea or DPRK case of denuclearization case, that during the Trump administration and even before that, Obama's administration continued to ask China to exert pressure on North Korea to change its behavior. At this time, other countries also saying that, oh, you can influence Putin. No, we can't. We can't influence, Kim. We can't influence Putin because they have their own strategic goals and they will do whatever they wanted to do without external, pressure. At this point, I think, of course, China has already conveyed our dissatisfaction of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and of course not openly, but in our communication with Russia, we said repeatedly in open forum that we don't like the current war. We wanted it to stop immediately, and both sides started political negotiation for a real settlement. And actually, we're satisfied with the Minsk agreement, with Minsk process. However, that process was not seriously executed by both sides. And if we started talking about, seriously political solution, we need to go back to the negotiation table. However, at this point, I think both sides wanted to continue military operation until they can achieve some kind of upper hand or superiority on the negotiation table. So we still have to wait and see what's happened. And at the same time, I just want to emphasize one point, that shelling of civilian areas is not just the Russians are doing. I think the Ukrainians are doing the same thing. And in the past 8 years, they attacked the civilian areas in Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine as well. So war is ugly. And I think from Chinese perspective, we don't want war. We want it to stop.
Yeah, I think your point is well taken. That is, it's probably beyond China's control vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. In other words, China probably has very, very limited influence over Putin with respect to how far he wants to take the war. But back to the U.S.-China relations, you've laid out a number of suggestions for policymakers and policy analysts to think about the future of U.S.-China relations. We have a question from the audience that is, what are the real options for the two sides to improve U.S.-China relations? And how long do you think this current tense relationship will continue? Particularly, this question is relevant on the heels of the 20th Chinese Communist Party Congress, right?
Yeah, exactly. Before I go into concrete suggestions, I wanted to give you one story that I used to fly back from the U.S. and on board there's another State Department official that's sitting beside me, and I was just talking to him on one issue, and he said, well, we talk about what President Xi said, that the Pacific Ocean is big enough for both China and U.S. to share. And his understanding, interestingly, is that China wanted to divide Pacific Ocean in half and drive the U.S. out of the western part of Pacific. I mean, that is not Chinese strategic goal. That is definitely not China's perspective, because that's the difference between East and West. In China, we're thinking in this Taiji, in this very Chinese way of thinking things. That is, we can share the space, we can coexist in the same space. But for the United States, and for a very long period of time, they dominate the world stage, and they think that if you talk about sharing with me, that means either you want to kick me out or you want to take my place. So in all those recent documents in the United States, you can see that how U.S. sees China, that China wanted to replace the U.S. as the world hegemon, or China wanted to basically get rid of or revise the current international order that dominated by the U.S. So basically, it's again a zero-sum game thinking. But in Chinese, it's not a zero-sum. It's always a win-win kind of thinking that is building or creating the cake bigger, and we share. We both get a bigger share. So without fundamentally changing the way of thinking for both sides and to agree on a certain pattern of thinking, then again, we don't have the strategic trust to go further. And in terms of concrete suggestions, there are many things we can start. For instance, we can reopen consulate in Houston and in Chengdu. That's very easy to do. And number two, with such a high inflation, why can't the US cut tariff, and in return, China also cut tariff to the United States? I mean, that's very easy to restore a very normal WTO-based trade system between the two countries. And also, the US can easily restart and rebuild the appellate court in WTO, and the US can continue to sue China, and even with better winning proportions against China, and it has a very good track record in the past. And also, there are other suggestions. For instance, both sides, as we stated in the last report on South China Sea, both sides can definitely create rules of contact or of encounter in the sky, on the sea, under the sea, and make contacts, regular contacts, safer, and to avoid any further conflict, and also make the U.S. More confident and less feeling threatened by China in those areas. And China at the same time can also observe and monitor U.S. activities near China and make China feel safer. So, and the last thing is, of course, we can reduce tensions across Taiwan Strait. The U.S. can reduce the amount of arms sales to Taiwan in exchange for China limiting its military activities around the vicinity of Taiwan Island. So again, if we have trust with each other, if we do trust each other, then we have so many ways to create a common space to coexist peacefully.
Yeah. It's certainly true that we need to adopt new thinking about the great power relations. Sometimes we see inconsistencies too, right? From China's statement, for example, when President Xi Jinping talks about Asian security, he used the language of Asians ought to be the people that solve problems in Asia. That very much sounds to the American ears of the China's Monroe Doctrine. In any case, my colleague, Professor Shahata, asked a question about U.S.-China relations during the over the past couple of years. The question essentially is as follows. Well, it's certainly true that the U.S. bears some bears some blame for where the bilateral relationship is, particularly the growing concerns in China about U.S. intentions. But isn't also the case that China?
I saw that.
You saw that in Hong Kong.
It's a difficult question, and from my position, I cannot really criticize China's policy, but yes, I think there are some problems of China's policies. I think we need to recognize that. On Xinjiang, for instance, I don't deny that there are some violations of human rights in Xinjiang. There some policies are way out of line, and I saw it personally because I visited Xinjiang 4 times in the past 3 years. However, if the U.S. wanted to make Xinjiang better and help the Uyghur people, they really shouldn't use genocide or painted Xinjiang as in such a way and use policy in such a way that actually hurt Xinjiang people. Because there is no, I really don't think that the situation in Xinjiang meet the criteria of genocide. That's number one. And even State Department officials themselves told me that their own domestic internal, their lawyers disagree with Pompeo when he wanted to use that. That's number one. Number two, the US imposed severe trade restrictions on Xinjiang products, which are produced by local Xinjiang people. And actually, if you use that, you reduce the welfare of local people. It's not helping them. So I just don't understand that actually the US can exert some pressure on China and started communicating with China on the human rights issues and help China to reduce the worry about Islamic extremism and also domestic terrorism by providing some help, but rather the US choose another way to basically exert maximum pressure on China and trying to, I don't know exactly what they wanted to achieve, because I asked some of the US officials that exactly what do you want to get out of this policy. They have no answers. They just say, oh, Washington just want to show that they are dissatisfied. They just want to pressure China. And the other things, again, Hong Kong, I agree with you again that Hong Kong government and also the central government has some problems, have a lot of mistakes in terms of dealing with the protesters and satisfying their demands. But I think, again, from China's perspective, there are people who are behind the scenes trying to make the Hong Kong case worse. And in particular, civil disturbance on the civil unrest that is hurting Hong Kong people themselves. So without a peaceful environment, Hong Kong's business is going down. Hong Kong's education, medical system is not functioning. So it's forcing the hands of the central government to unilaterally apply national security law. So in many ways, I think ultimately there's no other way to go other than to take over some of the control of Hong Kong. But to me, I strongly believe that the bigger Bay Area is the future of Hong Kong, because if Hong Kong continue that way of the social unrest without finding a clear path forward, then the city is wasted. and right now, I think it's on the way to recover, and hopefully Hong Kong will maintain some of its political and legal autonomous status, and make that Hong Kong's future brighter. I visited Shenzhen, the other part, across the ocean. I mean, across the sea from Hong Kong, and the northern part of Hong Kong will build into a tech hub, and in the future connect with Shenzhen, and will make that area much more developed. So that's what I hope that the Hong Kong people will benefit from it. And one last word about Taiwan. I think you used the word saber rattling. I think from Chinese perspective, we need to do that because right now the military deterrence is the only option, the last option that China can deter this continuous trend towards Hong Kong, towards Taiwan independence. And there are strong forces in the U.S. Basically bought by lobbyists from Taiwan, spending millions to advocate pro-Taiwan independence agenda. And that agenda is destabilizing the bilateral relations between China and the US and pushing the two countries closer to war. So again, I think China's military preparation is not trying to launch a war without any excuse, just say, oh, we wanted to unify and then we'll cross the Taiwan Strait. It's just to deter any political adventurism from the pro-independent forces on Taiwan. And those forces are actually using that as a political, as a political agenda to route support domestically in order to win elections again and again. However, they disregard the potential of using that political excuse to push for their own agenda that brings the world into a conflict. Mm-hmm. So again, I mean, I'm not just defending China's policy, but I'm just saying that from my understanding that some of those policies are necessary, even though it's not, I not completely agree with all of their policies.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the Taiwanese public hasn't really changed its stance on the relationship between Taiwan and China, the cross-strait relationship. That is consistently, the opinion polls suggest that majority of people in Taiwan wanted to maintain the status quo.
Status quo, yeah.
There's no appetite for de jure independence. After all, there is de facto independence. I think that's something we need to recognize. And just briefly, lastly, could you just offer some brief comments about your recent experience to Xinjiang and then human rights in Xinjiang, etc. And then we'll wrap up.
Well, you have to understand that Xinjiang is a huge, huge area. And basically you can divide Xinjiang into 2 or 3 parts. The most severe problem happened in southern Xinjiang, where Uyghurs concentrate. Actually, in northern Xinjiang, Han Chinese is more than half now, and the other half consists of multiple ethnicities, including Mongolians, Kazakhstans, Kazakhstan, Russian, and a lot of ethnicities. So Uyghur is not the majority ethnic group in northern Xinjiang, and northern Xinjiang is much more peaceful than southern Xinjiang, has much less terrorist threats and foreign connections. Only a very limited area in southern Xinjiang, south of the desert, there are a couple of towns used to be oases, right, connecting with each other, that are close to Pakistan and also across the mountain connected to Afghanistan, that are under influence of extremism, tends to have tendencies towards extremist activities, including terrorism. And what happened is that in the past decade, actually 2 or 3 decades, because of the rising international terrorism and also because of the rising Islamism in the region and the reduction of communist control, that whole region is destabilized. And so actually the failure of Chinese Communist Party's policy contributed to the current heartland policies against Uyghurs. Because if you do things in advance to prevent the infiltration of extremism into the population, then you don't have to apply a very hardline policy against those people. So now, because it's deeply embedded, they need to go there, basically root the extremism out in order to restore social order. And that's what happened from 2015 to 2018. A lot of people are sort of detained or camped into those re-education camp or whatever you call it, training center. They were, basically collected and put into that camp and then examined, tested, educated, trained, and then released. So currently, I mean, if you go there 4 years ago, there are probably close to 1 million people. But right now, if you go back there again, the majority of people have been already reviewed and trained and released. So that's why, again, I disagree with American policy towards Xinjiang, is that they're applying a policy dealing with a problem that happened 5 years ago, not what's happening today. Of course, there are continuous problems like cutting ties between the Uyghurs in outside and their family connections in Xinjiang, and also limiting the freedom of some of the Uyghurs and some of the ethnic discriminations, particularly in terms of Islamism treatment. I think there are a lot of places, in many respects, we can improve the treatment of Uyghurs. We can improve our minority policies in southern Xinjiang. But I mean, it's already happening, because now the Xinjiang boss is Ma Xingrui. He replaced Chen Quanguo, the former party boss in Xinjiang, and his policy is much more, I don't know how to describe, softer and much more focused on economic development rather than political repression. So it's actually the situation in Xinjiang is improving. It's the safest province in China. It's the most promising area for development in the future because of its energy and other, and because of its large land and resources. So again, I think the right policy for US and China is to work together to reduce some of the wrong policies and to promote economic development in the region. Because I saw many ignorant Islamists treating their women and children very badly in southern Xinjiang because of their closeness and because they wanted to mimic Afghanistan or Turkish treatment under Islamic law. And that is, I think, moving backward. It's not, and we hope to modernize that society. Mm-hmm. And in that respect, hopefully we can work together instead of fighting with each other.
Well, on that positive note, let me wrap this up as we have gone beyond our initial timeline. Some of our students have left because they have classes, not that they don't like your discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed your discussion, and thank you so much again for providing so much food for thought. Your perspective is very, very useful and very enlightening. We thank you again for staying up late. We thank you for participating in this discussion. We certainly hope to invite you back. And it's a great joy to host you on the personal level as well. And let's stay in touch. And thank you very much again. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. You take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.